I'm Omali Yeshitela, the chairman of the African People's Socialist Party, USA, and the chair of the African Socialist International, which is the global organization of African People's Socialist parties throughout the world where African people are located. I have organized this discussion today in order to establish our full and non-conditional support to make this statement of solidarity with the government of Nicolás Maduro and the people of Nicaragua, people of Venezuela, in the face of this this escalating assault that's being made on the people, their lives, their rights, their sovereignty by the United States government. It is very difficult to be watching this scenario, living in the United States with this history of the oppression of African and indigenous people, living in a country where half of that includes half of Mexico that was stolen at gunpoint, where people talk constantly about the establishment of a wall to keep the Mexican and other people south of this artificial border that was created by the United States out of the United States. To be here where there are scores and hundreds of thousands of indigenous people living in concentration camps called Indian reservations, in a country where 1 out of every 8 human beings who is locked up in a prison is an African in the United States. To be here where it has been estimated that it would take 228 years for the income of the average African family or to catch up with the white family, the colonizer family, and to hear Donald Trump talking about, and the US government talking about this aggression on the people of Venezuela as some kind of foray in democracy. To watch the arrogance of imperialist white power, to be in Washington, D.C. or any other place, not just Washington, D.C. We've seen it happen from England as well, to declare that some person who has not even run for office in Venezuela is the president. For a man to stand up in a crowd and say, I am the president, and then to see the United States government declare, yes, you are the president, to see the government of England stand up and say, yes, you are the president. And not only are you the president, but we, that is to say the British, are giving the legitimate government of Venezuela 8 days, and that was something like 2 or 3 days ago, to have a new election. And before we will initiate sanctions and other kinds of actions against the government of Venezuela. This is what we've seen happen. Now we've learned that the US government, taking all the assets of the people of Venezuela, that they can, billions and billions of dollars, and they're turning the billions of dollars over to the person who they have declared to be the president of Venezuela. These are difficult times. These are difficult times for the people of Venezuela, and these are times that should concern us all. Everybody who is interested in seeing a different kind of world, who really is engaged in trying to change this world, to recognizing that we are in a great contest between this past of white arrogant domination of the world, where it has been determined that everybody has to do what the white man wants them to do, or the white government wants them to do, or the imperialist powers wants them to do, or face horrible consequences. This is This is the past. This is the colonial domination of the world. There's a contest, a magnificent contest that is occurring between that past of colonial domination, of enslavement of the peoples of the world, and between the struggle for a genuine kind of democracy, for people achieving their sovereignty, taking back their country, the resources for their own use, to be able to advance us into a new kind of world, a new social system where capitalism will be destroyed and wiped out off the face of the earth. Capitalism that was born from slavery, from an attack on Africa, that put an entire continent under bondage, that enslaved an entire continent, created a situation for where the life of black people on the continent of Africa was simply to be able to create wealth for the white world that created the capitalist system, where even the place that we call Venezuela and most of what is recognized as South America came into being. That is to say, they exist now as these different entities as a consequence of the slave trade, of transporting Africans into these territories to create wealth for the imperial powers that consisted of countries like Spain and France and Portugal and the United States and others. That's the world that we are determined to end, to destroy this world of colonial imperial domination. And that's something that should be understood. I see and hear people talking recently about the reason the attack on Venezuela is because of the oil. The U.S. government wants the oil. I've even heard people say that somehow the people of Venezuela needs to find a way to negotiate with their opponents inside Venezuela to bring it to some kind of peaceful conclusion. But the fact of the matter is, it's not just about oil in that sense. It's about the fact that imperialism is experiencing and has been experiencing now for some time a really deep and profound crisis. Because what we talk about as imperialism, we talk about an international capitalist system that came through slavery and colonialism. It rests on a foundation of slavery and colonialism. And it's been involved in a serious crisis because all around the world, people are fighting to take back their resources. They are not necessarily what we would consider revolutionaries, but they are people whose lives have been placed in in dire straits that they have had nothing they could do except to rebel. And so you see ongoing war, unending war that's happening around the world. Afghanistan, 17 years, Iraq, the attacks on Iran and various other peoples around the world. They're trying to push back history, push people back into states of slavery, etc. This is the crisis of imperialism. We must understand that this is not simply about Venezuela. It is about the continuing existence of a foul, rotten social system that cannot have any validation other than the brutality that it imposes upon the world and that it attempts to make appear to be the will and desire of masses of the people. There are no redeeming qualities of this social system, and it is in dire straits, and that's what we're looking at. Okay, we look at Venezuela, and that's very serious, and we want to say something about why Venezuela is happening. We look at that's one aspect of it, but you know, we just saw the Arab Spring that starts someplace in 2010-11. Where it surprised the hell out of the United States because they thought the imperialist powers thought they had everything under control. Then this had this spontaneous uprising by masses of people in Tunisia, in North Africa. You saw Egypt rising up. You saw people all over this area begin to rise up and challenge the status quo. It scared the hell out of them. It surprised everybody because they thought they had everything under control, especially in Egypt, where the United States government was sending several $1 billion every year to support this military that was in place. And Hosni Mubarak, who was the person who presided over this enterprise for them. And he and the Egyptian government worked hand in glove with the reactionary white nationalist settler state of Israel to control that entire area. They, in fact, were military outposts for U.S. imperialism, and the state of Israel continues to be a military outpost for U.S. imperialism. But with Tunisia and Egypt, which was which is a large country with a large military, moving away from the regimes that the United States and France had established to control that area. With this happening, it threatened the entire enterprise. And so what the United States came to be known as the Arab Spring, when they lost Egypt temporarily, when they lost Tunisia temporarily, it threatened the imperialist regime of Israel. It threatened the settler state regime of Israel. What that meant was it threatened the entire setup that they had created, because it is about oil to some extent. It's about oil. But it's more than that, because the U.S. controlling the oil that's coming from the Middle East, and it did have a monopoly on control of that oil, it meant that it controlled most of the world. It didn't just control Tunisia or Egypt or Iraq and places like that. It meant that it controlled France. It controlled much of Europe that relied on getting that oil. It controlled to some extent even what China could do, because China was dependent upon this oil as well. So controlling the oil was an incredibly important strategic thing for the United States, and it helps them to control the world. But what they've seen over a period of time is a loss of control in various places around the world, and Venezuela was one of them. And when Hugo Chavez came to power in Venezuela, 1998, 99, he was inaugurated, and he moved rapidly to empower the people of Venezuela. He rapidly began the process of making the oil wealth of Venezuela, taking it away from the hands of the imperialist powers and putting it in the hands of the people. He implemented free education for masses of people, rapid education that was being provided. And along with Cuba, they began to put healthcare in the most impoverished sectors of the population of Venezuela. Cuba sent more than 20,000 doctors into Venezuela who were deployed in the most impoverished sectors of the population. So you had the rise of the working and poor people in Venezuela. And like Cuba, the Venezuelan revolution was a threat beyond simply a group of people or the size of the population. It was a threat because it showed that the working people of the world, it was a government that inspired workers and oppressed peoples of the world to take control of their own power, their own resources, to actually take power. And this was a threat, again, to the establishment. And this was part of the crisis of imperialism. We had seen the crisis of imperialism deepen when we saw with the Nicaraguan Revolution in 1979. And then following that, the revolution that began to emerge in El Salvador. We saw the U.S. Successfully unite with the reactionary governments in Guatemala that killed thousands and thousands of indigenous people there, with the advice of Elliot Abrams, who is now the U.S. Special Envoy in South America for the Trump administration, and participating in what they're now doing in Venezuela. This is the reality. So the imperialists have been experiencing a crisis. And what they did, of course, in the so-called Arab Spring, when they started losing in some fronts, they initiated contradictions in other places. So, for example, they tried to do it in Iran. They had sleepers and people who are tied to the U.S. who live in various countries, who want to sell out their countries, who do sell out their countries for better treatment, for better conditions for themselves and their families and their classes. And so you have people who also have been educated and trained by the U.S. and would rather be with white people than to be with their own people. And in Iran, there's a sector of such a population that was there. And the U.S. was able to influence them to have demonstrations and what have you. And they wanted to use these demonstrations in Iran as the basis of being able to say that we're going to go in and help these poor people in Iran and attack Iran. But Iran successfully crushed this movement right away. And of course, this helped the U.S. and others to give Iran this character of being some kind of repressive regime that won't allow people to demonstrate. But the demonstrations were part of a U.S. ploy. Like they did the same thing in the borders of Russia and Ukraine, where they were able to mobilize people and chase the president out of power who had been elected to power, and now and put who they wanted to be in power in place. And they try to do that all over the world. They talk about democracy. They talk about how people are influencing or trying to influence U.S. elections. Where is the Democrat? Where are the Democrats? Where is Bernie Sanders on this question? All of the others who claim that Trump was elected by the Russians and the Russians are interfering in the so-called free and fair elections in the United States. What are they saying now when the Trump administration, U.S. government can declare that this person in Venezuela is the new president? Where are they? Where are the leftists? Where are the so-called liberals? Where's the Democratic Party? Where are all of them now when they see this thing happening, transpiring right in front of their faces? So the U.S. In the so-called Arab Spring, when they saw itself losing in Tunisia, what it did was open up fronts inside that region. And so they're the ones who had inspired this uprising, what they call an uprising in Syria, that could justify the United Nations and other forces, NATO and other military powers and the United States attacking Syria and to try to get rid of the Assad regime. Not because Assad is some beautiful Democrat or revolutionary or anything like that, but he was a Syrian nationalist. He was opposed to the illegitimate state of Israel. And so with the temporary loss of Tunisia and Egypt, that opened up all kinds of problems from them in that area. So what they want to do is make sure that nobody in that region could be a problem that would unite with and could help people in Egypt and could help people in Tunisia moving against that illegitimate white nationalist settler state that they call Israel. They did the same thing in Libya. They inspired some reactionaries in Libya to have some demonstrations, and they used that as the basis to attack Libya. And this was done with the Obama regime, and this was done with Hillary Clinton. This was an exercise of power of the AFRICOM, this entity that was created exactly for the purpose of keeping Africa and oppressed people on the continent of Africa locked in a permanent state of servitude and colonial domination. And so then Libya, Gaddafi, who was murdered, and now you have nothing but turmoil in Libya. We say turmoil, but what we do have for sure is the elimination of an opponent of U.S. imperialism, the elimination of an opponent to the illegitimate state of Israel, and therefore somebody who helps to sustain that relationship of oppression and exploitation that is constantly and permanently being challenged by peoples around the world. And so that's what's happening. We see now in Venezuela, they pretend that something was wrong with the Venezuelan election, so they're going to get it right by choosing a new president. And then they are going to take the assets of the Venezuelan people and then take them from the legitimate government and give them to this person that they created. Give them to the person that they created. And this is very serious, because what it means is that everybody who now gets paid, you see Trump, you see what happened with this little phony shutdown of the American government. And now they're shutting down the government of Venezuela. They want to shut it down. They want to make the Venezuelan government incapable of providing for the people in Venezuela, even of providing for the military in Venezuela, because the military, they got children that they need to feed and take care of, and they have doctor bills that they have to pay. U.S. puts the sanctions on Venezuela, so the people can't even get medicine. They can't even get resources, and they're driving the people into a severe state of desperation, with the objective being to have the people so starved out, so brutalized by the poverty that's being imposed on them, that they would turn against their own government. That's exactly what they do. So they want to use the Venezuelan government, the people, to attack the Venezuelan government and to destroy the government that brought them, for the first time in history, healthcare, brought them education, brought them resources that they never had before under colonial domination, either direct colonial domination or indirect neo-colonial domination. This is what the government of Venezuela under Hugo Chavez was able to do. But Chavez did more than that. He is one who reached out to oppressed peoples around the world. He is one who worked to create a new monetary system that would challenge the domination of U.S. imperialism. He was an incredible force that moved to try to take on the empire and try to organize other forces to do that. You had Evo Morales, who was somebody else in the region. You had Ecuador, you had Bolivia, Morales from Bolivia, Ecuador, all of these new forces now challenging the old setup. And then, so this is how the U.S., this is what the U.S. had to deal with. And listen to this. This is Wall Street Journal. And this is today, January 31st edition of the Wall Street Journal. And it's quite clear on what this attack on Venezuela is all about. It reads, the headline is Trump sees Maduro move as first shot in a wider battle. And it reads, the Trump administration's attempt to force out the president of Venezuela, this is what the Wall Street Journal says, force out the president of Venezuela marked the opening of a new strategy to exert greater U.S. influence over Latin America, according to administration officials. In sight isn't just Venezuela's Nicolás Maduro, but also Cuba, an antagonist that has dominated American attention in the region for more than 50 years, as well as recent inroads made by Russia, China, and Iran. While Mr. Maduro and his predecessor Chavez have long drawn Washington's condemnation, the Trump is stocked with officials who have long believed Cuba to be the more serious national security threat. They cite Cuba's intelligence operations in the U.S. and its efforts to spread anti-American views in other Latin American countries. The goal the administration thinking goes is to sever ties that bind Venezuela to Cuba and sink regimes in both countries. This is what the Wall Street Journal is saying. This has got nothing to do with the nonsense they're putting forth, and everybody, all of the bourgeois knows that. And it says, the emerging U.S. assertiveness stems from the desire of the White House to reverse a partial rapprochement with Havana by the Obama administration through the easing of sanctions and the island's opening to U.S. investment. The Trump administration's policy developed over the past 2 years has been driven in part by the ascent of Cuba critics, including Mauricio Claver Caron, a National Security Council official who had devoted much of his life to deposing Fidel Castro. And, they talk about a number of other things like that. But the real issue, of course, is that Venezuela is has been a part of this drive toward the future of free peoples. And the United States government has never been for free people in any place on the planet Earth. And it has always been upholding white power and the extraction of all the value of the oppressed peoples around the world. This is what keeps the United States economy afloat. This is what keeps the imperialist economy afloat. But the crisis is still there. I mean, they're still facing with Brexit in England, where the white people in England are driven by the same kind of economic and political forces as the United States is driven by. The white people in England want to split off from the rest of the European Union. And this is wreaking havoc all over England. And it's wreaking havoc for Europe, too, because to try to understand what this means with the loss of whatever it is that England brought to the economy and whatever, England automatically, to get out of this thing, it will cost them $100 billion or more. The crisis is still here. The crisis is here with the yellow vests in France, where you've got this criminal Macron, who is the president. And the people in France have the disappearing middle class, because now everybody in France is poor. Because of the policies of this regime. And what are the policies of this regime that's at play here? It is that they're raising the price, first of all, on petroleum, on gas. And this is just the last thing that they've done. But of course, there are the Africans who are saying, what the hell? The gas that you are complaining about prices being raised around, the gas, the petroleum that you are complaining about is petroleum that comes from Africa. And you talking about the yellow vest, we're going to have red vests because the red vests represent the blood that black people have shared to have gas and oil coming to you in France. The crisis is there. And it doesn't matter. I mean, Trump is vicious, and a lot of people have already died in Venezuela. They didn't just die in clashes in the streets and stuff like that. They died because the United States government kept medications from getting to the people. They died because of the depth of the poverty that's being imposed on them, that they get food lines are stretched out, and of course people having serious kinds of consequences through that. And so the United States is engaged in this very aggressive counter-revolutionary actions in an attempt to push history back. But the thing is, the reason that the people in Venezuela are having this difficult time in part is because of the lack of revolutionary activity by people in the United States, by people in England, by so-called revolutionaries in other parts of the world. The United States has lined up every sellout that's possible to line up, and they say this is the international community that's speaking. The international community is the United States, England, France, Israel, Germany, all the white countries, leaders of the white countries. And then, of course, what has just happened is that the election in Colombia, where you have a reactionary president in Colombia, which borders Venezuela, and then bordering Venezuela also is Brazil, where this reactionary has now come to power in Brazil, who's going to destroy the rainforest, and said publicly that he's going to be attacking the indigenous people in Brazil. And so this is who's lined up with the Trump efforts to destroy the government of Venezuela. I believe they have a greater capacity ultimately. They may have a greater capacity. Up to now, the United States lost in a vote inside the Organization of American States, where they tried to get the Organization of American States to stand by them in this attack on Venezuela. They refused to do that. The reason they lost the vote, by the way, is because of the Caribbeans. The Caribbean states refused to go down with it, so the United States lost that vote in the Organization of American States. But the fact is that most of the countries around the world have this dependent relationship with the U.S. They send, the U.S. extracts all their resources, most of the time in form of raw materials and things like that, and then they take the cocoa beans and they make cocoa with it, and they make candy bars with it, and they make other stuff, and then they sell it back to the people. And they do that all over the world. And so the people have this relationship with U.S. imperialism, even to get hard currency. So the U.S. is capable of bullying a lot of people right now. But the revolution is fermenting. It is actually growing under their feet. And while we can't say exactly how things are going to turn out immediately inside of Venezuela, the Venezuelan people are paying a hell of a price, and it is our responsibility to provide all kinds of solidarity with them that we can. We need to be able to make the U.S. and England pay a consequence for what it is that they're doing. And we don't have that capacity in some ways, but there are things that can be done, and we need to be able mobilizing our people everywhere. We need to be real clear that we know exactly what this government is doing and get over this stuff about Trump, Trump, Trump. It's U.S. imperialism. It has always been like this. It has never not been like this. It was like this before Trump was born. And so the thing is that we have to recognize our responsibility to overturn this nasty social system, and the social system itself rests upon a foundation of slavery and colonialism. If the people in Venezuela achieve their freedom, that means they achieve the control of their oil, their other resources, and peoples throughout South America would do the same thing. It means that we're going to have to get rid of, the people are going to have to get rid of these illegitimate leaders that the United States would put there, such as the one that's in Brazil, and they could only elect this guy in Brazil after they locked up everybody who was an opponent of him. They locked up everybody who was associated with the former government there that was trying to bring workers' rights and provide, to some extent, for the needs of the impoverished people and the indigenous people in Brazil. This is how the U.S. and this is how England, this is how whole white power stays in power. It's our responsibility to free the masses of the people, including ourselves.
And that is the thing that will bring imperialism down to its filthy knees. That's our responsibility. We have to build a revolution. We have to build a revolutionary movement. We have to build a revolutionary movement all around the world. There is no other solution. So yeah, we can mobilize, and we should mobilize. We can demonstrate. We should demonstrate loudly. We need to be able to hold freedom discussions. We need to be able to set up meetings and conferences all over everywhere in order to expose this reality, this relationship, the real relationship that the United States government and imperial white powers have with the rest of the world. We need to do that. We need to mobilize people in opposition to that. We need to also clarify that capitalism is a social system that came into existence, that is founded on the enslavement of African people and the colonization of African and other peoples around the world. And it must be removed from the face of the earth if we're not going to have a Venezuela over and over again. So that's our responsibility. And it's not just about the oil. It's not about the Venezuelan government negotiating with the opponents in Venezuela. If they were going to negotiate with their opponents, they'd be better off doing it directly with the U.S. government. You got people like Elliot Abrams. You got people like John Bolton. You got people like the guy who is over the CIA now. They have track records and must in many instances right there in South America, murdering people, killing people. They're war criminals, even going by the law that was created, international law that was created under the combined efforts, unity of the imperialists. They're international law, they're lawbreakers. They're war criminals, they're terrorists. The United States government is a terrorist organization. And so we have a responsibility to bring real change to the world. And you have a responsibility to demand the Democratic Party, where's Bernie Sanders, all these so-called leftists, to take a stance. Where's the Black Congressional Caucus on this question? Where are all these other people who are supposed to stand for freedom and justice and righteousness, etc., who want people to vote for them in 2016 against the Trump regime when they can't even distinguish themselves from the Trump regime. They're down with everything the Trump regime has done. They're down with the murders that's happening to our people here in the United States and every place else. So we say that we have a responsibility to organize to defend the Venezuelan revolution, the Venezuelan government, and in so doing we defend ourselves. And we advance the revolutionary project of the oppressed peoples around the world. These relate to E-Africa. Africa is our land, and Black people must be free. We must organize. So build the revolutionary capacity of the African Socialist International, build the African People's Socialist Party, support it to make revolution something that is the main trend in the world again, as it was in the 1960s. Uhuru.